welcome once again to Fantasy Fiction Focus. We have another guest with us today. We have Mik Plested with us today in Calgary, in fact, just down the road here. So good evening, sir.
Good evening to you. How are things with you tonight, Simon Rose?
Well, not too bad, not too bad. Obviously, I would ask you what the weather's like, but we're in the same city. Yes. It's the wonders of technology. Now, you're going to tell us all about yourself and everything too. But one thing I want to just ask you quickly here, I think you are probably what's known as an author of speculative fiction. Now, some people probably want to know what that is. What does it mean, speculative fiction? What is it?
Well, I mean, it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. But in essence, it is made-up stories. I think it's probably the easiest, to understand way to put it. The stories I write are stories that are not about real things. They are stories that I have made up. So non-fiction, or they're fiction, not non-fiction.
So okay, yeah, most people would say it's more science fiction and fantasy and things rather than romance or fairy.
Yeah, I suppose they might say that. I mean, there's a lot of different genres that I think fit into speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, some subgenres like superhero fiction, steampunk, all of those things. Yeah.
But you're a science fiction and fantasy man, aren't you? Really, I think.
I am, and right now, most of the books that I have in print and stories that I have in print are aimed at a younger audience, so they would be considered young adult or middle grade.
Oh, okay. And so, how long have you been? Well, I know you've been writing for a long time. Just become sort of well, you've entered the publishing world in more recent times, I suppose. How long have you been writing?
I've been writing since I was probably in about grade 4 or 5. Do I date myself? Yeah, that was probably almost 40 years ago that I started writing. When I first started writing, it was just because it was something that I had fun doing and the stories were interesting to me. But as I entered the workforce, it became almost a coping mechanism. So work is not always fun. So there are days when you need an escape of your own, and sometimes reading will provide that, and sometimes writing. So more serious writing in the last 20 years, really trying to get published in the last 7. And my first book actually came out in 2012. So I haven't been published for very long, at a novel level at least.
But you've done short stories as well, though, before the novel, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I probably had my first short story out in, I'm going to say 2009. So, it's been 6 years or so.
Mm-hmm. And then the book. So the first book, are we talking then about the Mik Murdoch one?
Yes. So Mik Murdoch, Boy Superhero, was my first novel that was published. It wasn't my first novel that I finished, but it was the first one published.
But it's not just a novel, is it? It's a whole series of novels, isn't it?
It is a whole series. So it's kind of fun when you have a publisher interested in your book to start with. But when they ask you the question, how many books do you think it's going to take? And they're open to whatever number you throw at them, that makes it even more exciting. So what I originally conceived was a series of 6 books. The first 2 are currently out. So Mik Murdoch, Boy Superhero being the first, and Mik Murdoch, The Power Within came out in August of last year, so 2014. And the third one is actually with my publisher right now, and that one is tentatively titled Mik Murdoch, Crisis of Conscience.
Now, and how many did you say there were going to be in the end?
I think there will be 6, at least directly in the Mik Murdoch series. The interesting thing that I find is, as I'm writing the books and I'm creating new characters, I tend to fall in love with the new characters as well. So I've already got plans for a spin-off series from one of my original characters. So at the rate I'm going to need to live to be about 1,000 years old if I don't add any new stories or any new projects to the plans.
Well, you might live to be we might both live to be 1,000 years old. You never know with technology these days. But without giving us away too much of the story, can you tell us what is the gist of the whole Mik Murdoch theme?
Absolutely. So I guess to give you a bit of context, I grew up in a rural community. So I lived in the country. The town that I lived close to was a fairly small town. So as I was growing up, I read a lot of comic books, and I'm thinking to myself, I would really love to write a story about a boy who decides to be a superhero. That's not typically how superheroes happen, for starters. Usually you get some sort of a radioactive bug, or you're from a different planet, or some very weird concoction of events happen to you, and you kind of have that heroic bit thrust upon you. Mik actually decides that he's going to be a superhero in his small town, because every small town needs a hero. He decides that he's going to be a superhero after he comes home from watching Spider-Man, of all movies, with his father. And he's just so inspired by the idea of having super strength and being able to scale walls and shoot a web. I mean, what little boy doesn't want to be able to do all of those things? So that's really the beginning of the story. And, you know, it chronicles his journey trying to become a superhero and all those things that he learns along the way and the adventures he has as he goes. So really the first book is all about him trying to get superpowers.
And has it been well received, the first one?
It has been very well received. I've had a number of, well, pretty much every youth that I have come in contact with who has bought it, when they come and find me the next time, they buy the second one. And I know I'm a scout leader, and we'll talk about that probably in a little bit, but my first scout meeting was last week, and one of my youth came up to me, and his first question to me was, when is Mik Murdoch 3 coming out? Not what are we doing this year, when's Mik Murdoch 3 coming out?
Well, you've got some fans there. So now the third one is with the publisher. Is the fourth, well, the fourth, and probably the sixth and the fifth one probably aren't close to being done, but is the fourth one being worked on?
Yes. I have a pretty solid plot hammered out for that book already. I know what characters are going to be coming back, and that's part of the joy of having a long series like this, is I'm able to revisit characters that I had in earlier books and revisit places, and it gives a really nice, friendly, familiar, I guess, scene for all of my readers.
Yeah, well, so yeah, I'm just in the process of doing a couple of sequels myself, which I've not attempted before. I've not really been that interested in it. But are you okay with being in this Mik Murdoch world for, you know, what may be years? Are you okay with that?
Absolutely. And I guess part of my problem is I do have a lot of projects on the go. I don't write just in one universe at a time. I tend to have 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 or 5 universes all going at the same time. So I'm not stuck by any stretch. I write Mik Murdoch, and I work on the stories and I plot the stories whenever it grabs me. So that's the beauty of having a lot of different series on the go, is if I start to feel a little bit bored with one, I can move to another and work on it. And there seems to be a market for everything I'm writing at the moment. I just need to sell a lot of everything I'm writing.
Yeah, you mentioned that. Yeah, I think it's probably a good idea that if you might be getting a bit bored with the Mik Murdoch world, you know, it's only temporary, and you've got something else you could work on. Now, you mentioned just now about the scout thing, and I think you've also there's a Scouts of the Apocalypse, which is a very odd title. I've seen the cover of the book, and I think you've told me about it before. But what is that about? And I presume it was influenced by your time as a scout leader. What's that all about?
It absolutely is influenced by my time with Scouts. So the whole story actually began on our way to a winter, well, it was a late fall camp that we do every year, where our youth do survival shelters. And it is 2 hours out of Calgary. By the time we arrive at our camping area, it's off of a logging road, dense bush, no cell coverage. And as we were driving out, I had this idea in my mind of, you know, what would happen if we came back to Calgary and discovered that the whole world had fallen apart. So that was the idea, and I thought, okay, that's cool. And I put it back into my brain and just left it there, thinking maybe one day I would actually get to it. But that night, we were sitting around the campfire, and one of the boys decided to do ghost stories. And unfortunately, the ghost stories were silly ghost stories. They were incredibly bad ghost stories. And after hearing the third ghost story that was identical to the previous 2, and they all featured Rocky and Bullwinkle, by the way, just to give you some idea of how bad they were, I finally said, okay, guys, I can't stand it anymore. Have a seat. I'm going to tell you a real story. And I had never gone beyond the whole idea of, beyond the world falls apart when we come back. So I told the story of my scout troop the next day. So it was in the future, but what happened to us as we left camp and what we discovered. So that was good. They were riveted. They weren't interrupting me, which I thought was a good sign. And when we got back to Calgary, because we drive in a convoy typically, I parked my truck and I had this herd of scouts running toward my truck. And I thought, okay, what's going on? And they all were running toward me and they were shouting, "Scouter Mike, we didn't see any zombies." And so I'm talking to the other leaders afterwards and they're saying, oh yeah, they were watching for all of the visual signs that you used in your story. They were quiet the whole way home and they were watching for zombies that whole way. So I thought, okay, I've got something here. And I immediately went home and I wrote down the 6,000 words that I had told in my condensed fireside story. And I have since expanded that considerably, but it is the story and it is of my scout troop, although the names have been changed to protect innocence, maybe the wrong word, but to protect the scouts and myself, I guess, from being sued. And it actually takes place in the Calgary area. So for those people familiar with this part of Alberta, Water Valley's featured in there, Cochrane's featured in there, Callaway Park, although it's not called that because I didn't get permission to use the name, is in there. It all kind of happens in that particular area. And there are 2 more books coming in the series. It will be a trilogy when it's all finished.
And you came up with this off the top of your head around the campfire, or had you already got an idea in mind?
Other than the kernel of the idea, I knew it was going to be zombies, but that was it.
And you remembered it all the next day enough to write it down?
I did.
My goodness me, you must be a writer or something.
I must be. Well, and I've been asked, I have a camp coming a few days after you and I are recording, and I've already been asked to basically tell the story of the next book. So
you're going to be a busy man. Now, the other, again, speaking of odd titles, there's another one with an odd title that is, of course, I'm familiar with it, which is Galaxy Billies.
Yes.
What on earth is that?
Galaxy Billies is a story I wrote as a bit of a, I'm not even sure how to describe it. Let me back up a step and say 2 of my favorite writers of speculative fiction are Douglas Adams and Terry Brooks. I read their stuff all the time, reread their stuff all the time, because of course there's only so much of it left because Douglas Adams and Terry Brooks have both passed away. Or I'm saying Terry Pratchett, sorry, have both passed away. So I got the idea in my mind that I was going to write and podcast a story in 40 weeks, going against all of the advice of people that I knew, because I'm a podcaster. I kind of knew I was doing something rather bold and foolhardy. So it was meant as a bit of a, I guess, to honor those 2 writers that I like so much. So I decided I was going to write a story, in a humorous story, in a bit of the same sort of vein as Douglas Adams and Terry Pratchett. And while both are humorous speculative fiction writers, their styles are different enough that it was an interesting challenge to not only write an 80,000 word story in 40 weeks and podcast the entire thing. So that was my challenge to myself. I managed to put an episode out every 2 weeks. It was a full cast podcast, meaning that every character had their own voice. Now, the one way I got away with that is if I were to use voice actors, it would have taken probably 5 times as long to do, just because you're always waiting for the voices to come back. So I cheated a little bit. I actually used GarageBand, which is a Mac program that I use for podcasting quite extensively. And I did a number of different tricks. I did voice pitching, I did accents, I did a number of different things so that every one of my characters ended up with a different voice. But at the end of the day, I did all of them but one. So I did it in 40 weeks. I wrote an 82,000 word story that is in the same sort of vein as Terry Pratchett and Douglas Adams. about 5 hillbillies from the Appalachian Mountains who are kidnapped into space by a semi-sentient starship. And it is a humor story. It's currently up on Wattpad. I think I checked the stats yesterday. I've hit 50,000 reads on it. It's also a podcast up on podiobooks.com.
That's pretty good. Yeah, I wasn't aware it would take you that long to do that. I remember you telling me about it. Now, the podcast, Get Published, is not just for you to talk about things. It's for yourself. You interview people and have interesting topics. You've had people on there before, like other writers, haven't you, and talked to them?
I've even talked to a guy by the name of Simon Rose on that podcast a couple of times.
That seems to be a few years ago now, actually. Yeah, but I do remember that. It was a very enjoyable experience. But you've had people on there a bit like this, I suppose, but obviously not with the video.
That's right. So I've been a podcast enthusiast for a number of years, and I decided that it was time that I dipped my toe into that vast sea. And I actually wanted to do a podcast novel, which ended up being Galaxy Billies, but I wanted to be comfortable behind a microphone first. So my initial idea for a podcast, which ended up being Get Published, was a monthly podcast that I would talk about various writing topics. And I would do the research on it, and I would spend 20 or 30 minutes on it. I realized very quickly that just my voice probably is more than a little bit tiring. I also learned that there are a lot of people out there who have their own stories about getting published. And so at the time, I had not been published yet, except for maybe a short story. And I started to invite people that I knew, and I just put a general call out. And the next thing I learned after doing that was a monthly podcast simply wasn't going to cut it, because there were so many people eager to be on a show like mine. And I began interviewing people in episode 4 of Get Published. The show is in its 6th year now. I have, I think, 158 episodes. Probably in that, I have talked to over 120 different people, and that's been authors and editors and publishers and agents and artists and anybody I could find who has a role in publishing or has their own story of being published. So it's not really about me just talking about a certain item. It is trying to get those different stories, because there's value in all of them, and everybody's journey has been a little bit different, including mine.
Yeah, I found this doing these video interviews, a similar sort of thing. You meet a lot of nice people. I've talked to some people that I know, and I've talked to a lot of people that I don't in Canada and the US and even the UK. And yeah, everyone's journey is different, and you learn so you think, oh, I'd never heard of that, or I hadn't thought of that. I don't do podcasting myself. It's an awful lot of work. I find this enough work on its own, but you do a great job with that. But one thing I wanted to mention as well, of course, you haven't just written books on your own. You have been a collaborative author, haven't you, as well?
Yes. So I've not only written a book, and the book I think that you're referring to is Jack Kane and the Statue of Liberty, which is a YA superhero steampunk humor. It's got a number of different mashups in it that I wrote with an author by the name of J.R. Murdoch, and he's down in San Diego, California. So we got the idea to work on this book several years ago. We met via Twitter, so social media. We kind of became friends over Twitter, and we discovered that we had similar writing journeys and similar writing styles. And it was suggested, and I'm pretty sure I suggested it. He thinks somebody else suggested it. Who suggested it's really unimportant at this point, but that we write a book together. And so we talked about it briefly and decided, yes, that was something we wanted to try. And I remember our first night, we sat down via Skype, and we started just hammering out ideas, what kind of genre we were going to do, what the characters were going to be. And by the end of the night, we had a pretty solid, rough plot and the whole lineup for the book. Now, that first book that we collaborated on, we learned a lot of things, and we used tools like, it was Google Docs at the time, which is, I think it's probably similar now. But one of the things we did is we decided to write this book over NaNoWriMo. And we had, by that point, by the time NaNoWriMo began, which is National Novel Writing Month, so just for those of you who haven't heard of it, you have the goal is to write a 50,000 word novel in 30 days in November of every year. We had the plot down to the point where we knew what characters were doing what things at what time and what chapter and what scene and which one of us was writing it, because we decided he would write the protagonist and I would write the antagonist side of the story. Little different than some collaborations, but that's how we decided to do it. So NaNoWriMo began. We each had a copy of the extensive plot, and we went away, and we each started working on our own thing, which on the surface sounded like a really great idea. But when we got back together at the end of November and brought our pieces together, we discovered that we had all sorts of continuity errors. So, you know, maybe a character's wearing a hat in one scene and not in the next, or they're, you know, they look a certain way in one and they look different in the next. We had all of these silly little continuity errors, and we had a book that was about 2/3 done, filled with them. And that was a huge, huge pain to fix all of those errors. It took us longer to fix the errors and to write that part. But then we got to a key chapter, and we decided we were going to try to write it in a slightly different way. And Google Docs has a really cool feature, and that is you can both be in the document at the same time. So he would be writing, and I would actually have the document open, and I could see the words magically appear on the page. It was awesome. And he would write a partial scene or a scene, and then it was tag, I was it, and I would write my response to it from the antagonist perspective. And then I would tag back to him, and we just went that way, skipping back and forth. And we managed to write that entire, and it was a key chapter. We wrote that whole chapter in about 3 days with no continuity errors whatsoever. We had stumbled upon the secret sauce for our writing, at least as a collaboration.
Will you be working together again on something else after this one?
We're actually we've actually got a 3-book kind of a plot stream for this story. So Jack Kane will come back to life again. So this book was published by Champagne Books. We are actually in the process of writing the sequel to it right now. So we are doing it in the back and forth way, as opposed to go off, you know, go forth, young man, and write, and then when we're all done, we'll try to stitch it together. And I have already seen it's going much smoother than it did before.
Yeah, so that's Champagne Books, and obviously you have publishers with the other ones and short stories and everything. But you now also have Alter Ego, Evil Alter Ego Press, which is your own publishing company now.
That's right. So I have Scouts of the Apocalypse is a book that I wanted to have full control of. I've considered having it published traditionally for a while. I considered doing self-publishing on it. I have worked with a gentleman by the name of Jeffrey Height. He and I have actually edited 2 anthologies together. And we had an idea for an anthology called Dimensional Abscesses, which is about basically negative portal stories. So portals to places you don't want to go. So if you think of the wardrobe going to Narnia, it's not that. It's going to someplace much, much worse. So we had put out a call. We had a number of stories, a bunch of different authors. We thought about, okay, how do we want to bring this and publish it? So the first anthology we had done, we went with a publisher. This one we wanted to control. We thought about doing self-publishing on it, and then it seemed to us that the right way to go was to form our own imprint, not just because we wanted a vanity imprint, but because I have been, in the short time that I have been published, I have talked to a lot of authors who have had various complaints or various wishes about what they would like their publishers to do or to be. And it seemed to me that there are enough authors out there who were like me, who are searching for a press to help them get started, that if I could help 1 or 2 out, and you know, over the years, I've been helped by authors like yourself, Simon, and I've tried to pay that forward with others. And this is another means to do that. So we created Evil Alter Ego Press, First, to bring our anthology out, so to represent all of those people who helped collaborate on the anthology, then to bring out Scouts of the Apocalypse out. And we've actually just signed a new author by the name of Susie Vadori, and her book should be out just before Christmas of this year. So she'll be our first, I'll call it non-family author, because she's not actually directly tied to the press. But yes, we created Evil Alter Ego Publishing. Our hope is to initially bring out 3 to 4 books a year. We'll probably be opening, I'm thinking opening for submissions late next year to see if we can bring another author in.
So, okay, so you're not going to be abandoning writing to become a publishing mogul anytime soon?
No, I enjoy the actual writing part of it and bringing the stories out too much. I see this as an extension, and I'm one of those people who, when you are doing something, I like to know what all the moving parts do and how they work. So for me, I've been on a continuous learning curve since I tried my first time to get published, just to understand how everything works and to get a better look under the covers, so to speak, to know why the publishing machine is so slow, because it is. It's slow to get a book published. From the time you sign a contract to the time you see it in that box on your step the first time, it can be a while. So I want to understand that better. I want to see if I can improve on it. I want to see if I can help other authors come forward with their work and have it see the light of day.
Well, it sounds like you've got an awful lot of things on the go, all very exciting stuff, and lots of books of your own still to do that are not even started yet. You're going to be very busy for a long time. So thank you very much for taking time to be with us on Fantasy Fiction Focus this evening. I've got time to talk to people like me. You're such a busy man. But thanks for being on here. Good luck with everything. I will see you around, of course, on the circuit, I'm sure. So thank you, sir.
Thank you.